Hello everyone, welcome back, and thank you to those who responded to my last video. It did give me a bit of encouragement to keep this thing going. So I thought today I would do a response video to a channel called Kevin Towell Reads. So Kevin does this thing on Booktube where he poses certain questions to his audience and then allows them to respond either in video form or in the comments, just to kind of get a conversation started. So I will link that below, and the question that he asked this time around is, are classics still relevant? And basically he was talking about sort of how he feels intimidated by the idea of what a classic is, but then he went on to list several books that might be considered classics that he has engaged with and that he has read. So while I was thinking about what I consider a classic and how I define a classic, so I just went up to my bookshelf and picked out 5 books that, without really thinking too deeply about it, I just instantly picked up 5 books. The first 5 that occurred to me that were classics that were in front of me. And I want to reflect a bit on why I think they are classics. So in the video that Kevin did, the way he defined a classic, which I think is pretty accurate in some ways, is that a classic is just any book that has an extraordinary staying power, in the sense that it always feels relevant to the times, regardless of what time period it was written in. It's a book that speaks across generations. But I also think there are more than one ways for a book to be a classic, and I'll talk a bit about that once I get into the actual books that I selected. I think certain books can be considered classics if they are written in such a way, or they do something with the narrative or with just the writing style that alters the way fiction is written or sets a new kind of course for literary work. And another element that I would consider makes a book a classic is if it serves as some kind of hallmark or cornerstone for a particular genre or a particular type of fiction. So I'll just go through the first 5 books that I randomly selected, and this is not an exhaustive list, obviously. I think this is more a reflection of what the kind of stuff I just tend to read and what's available in my kind of physical pile of books that I have, because I would say that half of my books tend to be like in ebook version anyway, not in these days. So yeah, this is more of a reflection of personal taste, but let me get into it. So the first book that caught my eye, which is very much a no-brainer, was Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I think this is very much the kind of book that people think of when they think of classic literature. So the thing about Jane Eyre is that it's not only a very enduring narrative, and not only does it have a protagonist who sort of speaks to a certain sensibility that carries well across time. Jane Eyre is also one of those books that has been written about so much. I think that's another really key thing that characterizes classics, is that there are so many spin-offs, so many books or rewrites or sort of responses to the fact of Jane Eyre, to elements in Jane Eyre that are actually problematic, the wife in the attic sort of thing. I think it's just about how culturally impactful this particular work has been that solidifies it as a classic. So the next book is also very canonical. I just picked up Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. It's about a boy who lives in utter poverty and destitution and comes into great fortune. And it's about the man that he becomes and the internal journey that he takes as a result of that rags to riches story, right? So at its core, that's what this story is about. And it's also obviously about infatuation, unrequited love, and a lot of other things. I think what this book does is that it exposes something that's so fundamentally true now of the world, because it was written sort of during that industrialization period, right? And it represents that sort of era. And it kind of exposes what industrialization did to our social norms. It feels so relevant in the present because the kind of emotional problems that the main character Pip faces in this novel, they're problem of economics, and they are problems of what a transactional society does to the nature of relationships and the relational dynamics. It's also about that kind of loss of innocence and that kind of coming to realization of what class and the divisions within society as a result of stratification does to a person and their relationships. So not only was that very evident probably in Dickens's time, but I think it's ever relevant in the world that we live in today and will continue to live in far into the future. It is about that idea of about what coming into wealth means and what it does to your psychology and what it does to your relationship to the people around you. And I think those concepts are universal and timeless. So the next one is also a work of Victorian fiction. I promise I'll sort of shift gear in the last two, but I just felt like I could not ignore Middlemarch by George Eliot in a video about classics. So Middlemarch is obviously about a young woman who marries a man who is much her senior, and she does this willingly because she thinks it's going to improve her intellectually. And this is a story about idealism and the loss of idealism. And it's much more than just that. The thing that makes this a classic is that I feel like it contains every possible sort of strand of humanity in it. George Eliot covers every level of society, every type of relationship. It deals with politics of the time. It deals with property, ideas of property. It deals with crime. It just deals with every facet of humanity. And I think, again, institutions have a very large role to play in keeping this alive. Just the way that social media has kind of altered our attention spans, I do sometimes wonder whether really long works of fiction will stand the test of time. But I think Middlemarch is one of those books that it just speaks so perfectly and is so in tune with human foibles that I just feel like it's just a classic. I don't know. So the next book that I picked up is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. This is a very different book from the Victorian stuff that I was looking at, but as soon as I glanced at it, I was like, of course, that's a classic. So what makes Things Fall Apart a classic, in my view, is that it did something to literature. The book itself is written quite simplistically. The language is very simple. And the narrative is a very straightforward narrative as well, It's about this, sort of domineering, very fearsome sort of African tribesman. It's about sort of his downfall. And of course, the main character that we follow, he's sort of very against the Christian missionaries and colonials. And he sort of refuses to succumb to them, which is also kind of part of his tragic downfall. This book does that thing, altering who literature is written about and what perspective it's written from. And it's one of those books that you can say introduced something into just literary tradition that changed the way literature was written after it. So the final book that I picked up was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So similar to Things Fall Apart, I think 100 Years of Solitude, it did something to the way literature was written. There were a lot of books that came after 100 years that would not have been written the way that they were written if it weren't for the existence of this book and the impact that this book had. Because I think that it serves as that sort of genre hallmark. I mean, magical realism as a genre would not exist in the way that it does now. This is kind of a tough book to get through. I remember I read it like one really lazy summer, but I think it's very rewarding, and the ending is quite breathtaking as well. And I find it really fascinating as well that this book obviously was written in Spanish originally, and it's a translated work, and yet it has informed so much literature that was originally written in English, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children would not have been written if it weren't for this book. And I think what this book really reveals to me about what it means for a book to be a classic is that sometimes it's not about the language necessarily, but it's about what it does to the very act of storytelling and our perception of how a story can be told and what a narrative looks like. And I think this did something so radically different, or it opened up such a new avenue that it's impossible for a work like this to really be forgotten. If you have any thoughts on any of these books, or if you have a favorite classic, I would love to hear about it. Hopefully I've at least managed to communicate through the books that I was looking at, that I think there are just different ways for books to become classics, for books to stand the test of time. And I think the question of relevance is really built into a classic, because I think a classic is a book that never feels irrelevant. I think what makes a classic is a sensibility or a universal truth or a unprecedented innovation that cements its sort of place in time and ensures that it will always be read.